Good evening and welcome to the Media Democracy Festival hosted by the Media Reform Coalition. I'm Kerry-Ann Mendoza and I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. I'm Editor-at-Large of the Canary. The Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, researchers and media practitioners to develop policies and campaign for media reform in the light of a communications environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organisations and is characterised by insufficient plurality, diversity and accountability. I am joined by an absolutely fantastic panel of speakers tonight who are going to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes each. I'm going to introduce them and they're going to give you their best, and then we're going to hand over to you guys for questions and answers. So please don't be shy about popping in your questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible, and this is your opportunity to ask these awesome people the questions that are on your mind. So please do. So tonight, our event is going to be The Rise and Rise of Independent Media. It's a fantastic title, and it captures exactly the energy and enthusiasm with which we're building a new independent news media. I'm really proud to be a part of that. We co-founded the Canary, oh goodness, nearly 6 years now. It's 6 years in September. And when we did it, it was to address some of the issues that the Media Reform Coalition worked so hard to address, namely plurality, accountability and diversity. One of the things that we've noticed is that even in the independent news media space, some of the issues were sort of carrying over from the mainstream space, and those would be a lack of diversity in terms of the ethnic makeup of the journalists that were manning these newsrooms, and also the class background. So it seemed like we had a mainstream media that was dominated largely by white middle class people, and that was carrying over into the independent news media space. So what we wanted to do was create a new kind of journalism and a new kind of journalist, focusing on bringing all of this diversity of voice together to create the most powerful new media outlet. And we're really proud to achieve that. We get and do that work every day. And as challenging, as terrifying as it can be at times, it's also an enormous privilege to get to platform these extraordinary voices that otherwise may not be heard. So I'm now going to introduce our amazing panelists. First off, we're going to have Jonathan Heawood, who is Executive Director of Public Interest News Foundation. This is the first charity in the UK which exists to support public interest journalism. From 2013 to 2020, he ran the independent press regulator, Impress, as he regulates the Canary, by the way. He's also a senior research fellow at the University of Stirling and author of The Press Freedom Myth. And that's a critique of the a critique of the libertarian account of media freedom. I'm going. In fact, I think I'll introduce everyone, and then we're going to go back to Jonathan for his comments. So next up, we'll be speaking with Vanessa Baird, who is co-editor with New Internationalist magazine, fantastic outlet, which is a flat structure cooperative owned by its readers and regulated by Impress. Her recent work has focused on Can the People Be Trusted? Democracy on the Edge, Why We Must Back the Kurds, and Who Owns the Sea. Vanessa, thanks for joining us tonight. And last but most definitely not least, we have Peter Jukes, who is founder and CEO of Byline Times and an award-winning screenwriter. And thank you for that incredibly brief bio, Peter. Okay, those are our three amazing panelists. We're now going to go to Jonathan, who's going to speak to you on this topic. Jonathan, far away.
Thanks, Kerry-Ann. It's very nice to see you. It was very good, I have to say, when the Canary joined Impress back in the day, and it's always been a pleasure to regulate you. So, look, yes, independent media going from strength to strength. Let me just pause a minute to begin with and try and sort of set out what do we mean by independent media, because I think it's all very well to say independent media is not legacy media. That tells us one thing about indie media, but there's a hell of a lot more that we need to know about it. This is a big sector. We think there are at least 300 organizations out there that could be called independent news organizations. There may be many more. There isn't really a good map of the landscape, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. It's really important to understand independent media isn't just it's not just political media. You've got the Canary, but you've got a whole range of other sites and publications out there which are a bit more like traditional local newspapers, which set out to be impartial, to provide a forum for debate rather than actively contributing to political debate. You've got for-profit models and non-profit models. You've got cooperatives, you've got social enterprises, you've got sites that are aimed at particular communities, identity groups, people of colour. You've got sites like the Internationalist, which are aimed at people with particular interests, and you've got investigative non-profits. Some of those publications, like the New Internationalist, and we'll be talking to Vanessa in a minute, have been around for many years, for 40 years or so in their case. We're part of an older generation of alternative media, which is now going to come into this big dynamic sector. But many others like Byline have burst onto the scene in the last 5 years, or even the last 5 months in some cases. So it's a big, dynamic, fast moving sector with a lot of different characteristics. So it's not legacy. In that, obviously, it misses out on some of the weaknesses, as Kerry Ann said, of that highly concentrated sector, which is dominated by large corporate groups with a very particular set of commercial and political interests. But I think it's not good enough just to say indie media is not legacy media. That doesn't mean that it's better. It means it's different, and it has the opportunity to be better. But to be better, to contribute to a genuinely diverse media economy, there are various things that indie media needs to do. Now, the fantastic thing is that we've got the opportunity to do them, because there are distinct characteristics, that there are differences in the DNA of independent media that give it the opportunity to do different and exciting things. But like any sort of genetic code, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to flourish, that your genetic code is going to sort of live to its utmost, unless you're in the right environment and there's the right cultivation and encouragement and networks and infrastructure. So at PINT, we're trying to support those the networks that can help to develop and support independent media. But let me just flag up 3 things in particular that I think have the potential in indie media to be not just different from, but better than some of the failings of legacy media. So for a start, independent media is inherently collaborative. Traditional news media, big newspaper groups and broadcasters have historically been highly competitive. And if you stop and think about it for a moment, that's actually really bizarre, because news is not a commodity like a pair of trousers or a ride in a hot air balloon that is exclusive. It can't be packaged up and sold to someone, and you can't put a price on it on the basis of scarcity. News is in economic terms a non-exclusive commodity. Once I've told you something, you know that. You're free to go and tell someone else, and they tell someone else, and that's the whole nature of news. That's the power of it, is it travels through the ecosystem, through the public sphere. So to sort of set a price on that and then compete with other publishers for a share of an audience for the same product is actually really weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense economically. It doesn't make any sense culturally. So I think that one of the great assets of the independent sector is that most organizations in this sector are not trying to compete with each other. They're genuinely trying to collaborate and to work out what each of them can bring to the pie and how they can best cook that pie together. So for me, one of the really interesting initiatives in this space is the work of Bureau Local, which brings together lots and lots of small local independent news organizations with some central infrastructure to share ideas and stories to create big, hard-hitting investigations that are going to have real impact, because everyone's pulling together rather than pulling apart. So I think if we can maximize the scope for collaboration, the sector can do extraordinary things. I think secondly, the thing that is really different about this sector is it's much more democratic. So you've got organizations which have got inbuilt democratic structures like the Bristol Cable and the Ferret, which are cooperative, so they're actually democratically owned by their members and stakeholders. But more generally, I think there's a fantastic opportunity for independent media to rethink what it means to do democracy. So there's a very standard view in legacy media that the media is the fourth estate, and we sort of sit on high and we write about politics, but we're somehow not involved or implicated in politics. Now, as you all know, that's a myth which conceals a much messier reality where media is always already involved in politics. But the way that traditional media does politics is I think, quite conventional and quite stale and quite disempowering. If we reinvent that and actually think about what kinds of information do people need in order to engage in democracy and to be empowered and to participate, I think, you can come at that afresh. And because we're talking about small, nimble organizations which are really committed to democracy, there's an amazing opportunity to do democratic journalism differently, not just churning out 6,000 stories about the local council and assuming that that is democracy, but perhaps actually engaging with communities and saying what matters to you, what bothers you, what don't you know that you would like to know, what questions have you got that we can help you answer. And the journalist then becomes much more like a community organizer than someone who simply tells people stuff. And then finally, I think even deeper than that, there's a potential in this sector to be really transformative in how we think about power relations generally. So I've been very inspired by talking to people in the States, like there's an organization called Free Press, there's an organization called Press On, which is working across some of the southern states with primarily people of color, non-binary people and others, really trying to reimagine what it is to do journalism in a way that's collaborative, that is not, in their terms, extractive. What they call extractive journalism is where someone goes in, there's a particular crisis in a particular place or community, they go in, they interview a bunch of vulnerable people, they take their stories and they extract them, and they tell those stories to a whole different bunch of people over there. And that model can do great things. It can lead to social change. It can raise awareness of issues, but there's something uncomfortable about that power dynamic between the journalist who flies in and flies out and the community that are left behind grappling with the same issues. So the model that's evolving in the States, which I think we can learn from over here, is what they call movement journalism, where you see the journalist much more as a co-creator of information and knowledge with the communities they serve. But that requires a massive cultural shift in how journalists think about themselves and their role. So those are three things. I mean, there's a hell of a lot more we could talk about, but we have got at least the scope in this sector to be more collaborative, to be more democratic, and to be genuinely transformational in how we do journalism. I'll finish now, but I just want to say finally, one of the things that we're trying to do at PINF is, in order to raise awareness of this sector and to pull in support for the sector and to pull in funding, is we're trying to map the sector. So I said there's about 300 organizations out there that we think of as independent news organizations, but we don't know that, actually. I've plucked that number from the sky. It's a really rough guesstimate. So we're doing a thing at the moment called the PINF Index. And if any of you out there are independent publishers, you've got an organization, a publication to your name, go on to our website, publicinterestnews.org.uk, click the links, you'll see the index is there. It takes about half an hour to complete. And the data that we get from that, we can then aggregate and start to tell a slightly more evidence-based, comprehensive story about this sector, and hopefully persuade donors and others of its importance and therefore of the need to support it.
That was amazing. Thank you, Jonathan. I just found myself nodding vigorously there while you were chatting away, even though it was off camera. Is, one of the things that definitely has struck me, certainly recently. I think it's taken some time for us all to come together in the sort of new media space and, give each other a bit of a sniff and all that stuff, get to know each other, because many of us came into this unnetworked. You know, we weren't known quantities when we arrived on the scene, and we didn't go to university together, and the mainstream press. But actually, to see this coming together now and that level of cooperative working, it really is phenomenal. And as you say, it really is also unique. You know, that is not something that's really happening out there in the wider press. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Now we're going to go over to Vanessa. Vanessa, you are muted. Kindly unmute yourself. Thank you. Far away.
That's great. Okay. Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Jonathan said is that in terms of collaboration, a lot of us have been able to meet each other actually through Impress. So Impress has done a fantastic job in helping us in that respect, and that we can share information, we can help each other, and it makes working in the independent media and the left independent media just so much fun compared with what it's like working in the mainstream. But anyway, I think we're very familiar by now with the problems of most of the media, the lack of diversity everywhere you look at it, on race, social class, gender, and of course, media ownership. And we know the negative impact on democracy. For example, the public that still doesn't trust journalists to tell the truth, and the repeated failures of some of the most dominant media to hold power to account. And this hasn't been helped at all by the pandemic, which has exacerbated existing problems of shrinking newsrooms, making it harder for journalists lucky enough to have one to do their job properly. Now, the independent media is perhaps, one would say, should be in the most precarious state of all, lacking the deep pockets of even ailing media empires. And yet it's been this independent sector of small players mainly that in recent months has been the most dynamic and effective in calling out corruption and holding power to account. And at a national level, I'm thinking of, the work of Byline, Open Democracy, Canary and others, with their revelations about the procurement of PPE and the handing out of lucrative contracts to Tory cronies. And meanwhile, there's been, I think, another trend which has become apparent in recent times in the mainstream media, and that's towards parochialism and nationalism. I'm just thinking we're in the middle of a pandemic which is truly global. And yet, if you look at the way it's being covered by most of the corporate and broadcast media, it's as if they've entered a lockdown of minds as well as bodies. There's scant, if any, readiness to explore the one radical solution that could save millions of lives around the world. I'm talking about the waiving of patents or intellectual property rights on COVID-19 vaccines, which were delivered with the help of billions of public money, by the way, and the sharing of technology associated with that. Now, this could unlock massive vaccine production across the world. But somehow the idea of chipping into the huge profits that Big Pharma is set to make this year for the good of the world's people seems to be almost anathema in the mainstream, barely worth a mention. Yet with the political will, it's doable, even under the WTO. And so this is one of the stories that we at New Internationalists are currently working on and linking up with the broader campaign for this. So we need independent media, not just to tell stories that are being told, that aren't being told in the mainstream, but to give them depth and to give that in-depth treatment. So it's not just a sort of here today, gone tomorrow headline. To break out of the news cycle and to investigate things that are happening beneath the surface and in places and communities generally ignored by others. Media democracy is a local issue, a national issue, but also an internationalist issue. This pandemic and the other big crisis facing us, the climate emergency, tells us loudly and clearly that we're living in an interdependent world. So, what needs to be done? Well, several big proposals have already been highlighted, especially in Jeremy Corbyn's excellent keynote speech. Things like a cap on media ownership to reduce the overwhelming political influence of billionaires, and the overdue independent regulation of digital platform companies. But our democracy needs independent media. But for that independent media to survive, it also needs to be funded. As we know, the traditional model for paying for news, either directly or indirectly through advertising, has been pretty much hollowed out by the internet and the surveillance capitalism models of Facebook and Google, with a few exceptions. But as Thomas Barlow was saying in an earlier session, many journalists in the independent sector are working for very low or no regular wages. But news production costs money. And if you're not paying for the news you consume, who is? Running truly independent media, especially on the left, has never been easy. But these times are exceptionally tough, I'd say. Struggling media are vulnerable to native advertising and other furtive means by which companies or institutions can effectively buy content that puts them in a good light and is presented as news. One of the questions asked in an earlier session was, would adopting cooperative models help media democracy? And I think the answer is yes. And several small independent media outlets are in fact co-ops, and we've mentioned them just now. New Internationalist became a flat structure workers' cooperative in the 1980s. And since then, we've expanded our democracy by also becoming a co-op that is owned by its readers and supporters. We've now got about 3,400 co-owners in around 40 countries across the world. But the pandemic has left many media fighting for survival, and New Internationalist is no exception. So we're actually about to launch a COVID rescue plan, which will involve inviting more people to become co-owners and asking existing co-owners to think about increasing their support. This is the kind of thing that individuals can do to help journalism that stands for justice, truth, and solidarity, and against lies and bigotry. The campaign goes live in May, and if you want to keep updated, you can go to our website, which is newint.org, or there may also be a link in the chat a bit later on. But anyway, whatever independent media you value, please subscribe to them if you can. Click on their donate button, and if they have a community share offer, go for it. Become a co-owner. So I'm afraid with that almost totally shameless plug, I'm now going to hand back to you, Kerry-Ann.
That's great, Vanessa. Thank you so much for that insight. I just second the points. I think the democracy point is very well made, but also the idea that a lot of people out there are asking, what can we do? What can we do to help empower new media to sort of work on our behalf? And that's really the simplest way. And these are often, we're not talking about a lot of money that people need to chip in individually, because there are so many of us out there. Each person chips in a little bit, and it makes a very big difference at the other end. So thank you for that, Vanessa. That was really powerful, really great. Okay, and now we're over to Peter Jukes of Byline Times. Peter.
Thanks, Kerry, and thanks for inviting me. I just really want to pick up also what Jonathan and Vanessa had said. On collaboration, we actually worked with the New Internationalists recently to boost subscriptions. So I'm going to give a big plug to you too, New Internationalists. And it was at Impress where we met our web designers. So it is an amazing space that has been created, particularly by people like Jonathan, for independent media. I don't quite have the theoretical expertise of either of them. And as you build in my short bio, I began life as a dramatist. But I just take you through a dramatic little autobiography, because in a way that indicates to me some of those principles of collaboration and anti-monopoly behavior, which do, as Jonathan says, kind of characterize the pro-democracy element of independent media. I started off in fringe theatre in Edinburgh like 7 years in a row, and I loved it. I mean, it was because, as James Singh, the great Irish playwright, expressed it, all art is collaboration with the audience, with other writers and actors, of course, and directors and scene designers and everything. And I loved that phase. But then briefly in the West End, then I went to the BBC and whatever, it's a public service broadcaster, but it was run, so it is probably like a monopoly, where power devolves upwards, decisions are arbitrary. I lived about 15 years of this life for ITV as well, briefly in America. And America was much more democratic, by the way. was this feeling of terror. I mean, I briefly worked on a show about banking for an Italian company about 2 years ago, and this feeling of terror returned because all the structures are upward, the decisions are arbitrary, it's highly competitive among your peers, and then you have this tyrant, sort of like an angry giant who randomly you're in and randomly you're out. And I wrote an essay about this, Why Britain Can't Do the Wire, in 2009 for Prospect magazine, which went viral, if things did in those days, and was sort of excerpted in The Guardian. And it was the longest suicide career note in history, because I was basically saying, this is a terrible place to work, and one person runs 70% of the drama. How can that be? And thus began my life as a journalist, because I finally told the truth. And I ended up looking at another monopoly, which I do think is a key part of the abuses of the Murdoch empire, which is obviously Leveson and then the phone hacking scandal. And out of that, so this model of being a citizen journalist and then stepping forward obviously requires training. Journalism is a profession, it's a craft. Certain sections of it are highly technical, highly dangerous. The court is highly dangerous. But in a way, the word journalism comes to the idea that a journal, one day, we will all be citizen journalists. We'll all witness something. I also helped with Bellingcat. I gave it its name, not much more than that really, where online now you have not only citizen journalists, but a lot of information. And even better, during the phone hacking trial, what happened is I got sponsored to live tweet for the audience. They crowdfunded me. And what they liked was I wasn't BBC, I obviously wasn't Murdoch, and that I was really working for them. So that democratic attitude towards your readership, which I think, Jonathan was talking about the sense of participation and movement. I found that much more exciting than drama. And drama's actually quite boring. You sit in a room and then filming's like the most boring thing on earth. And I found terrifying at sometimes. I found journalism not only a lot of interaction. Journalists are quite fun as well. Even some of the dodgy papers, some of the journalists who work for dodgy papers can be quite fun. But also that sense of having a mission, an immediate reaction from your audience, and change the world. I wrote dramas about Bosnia or Iraq, hoping to change the world. Nothing happened. But I do feel through the journalistic work I started then doing with Byline.com, I was an advisor, then took over 5 years ago, the crowdfunding site, and various scoops. And then we started a festival, and 2 years ago now, almost, we started Byline Times, which is a very different model. I'll talk about funding in a moment, but just this point about the diversity of the sector, I think, Carrie-Anne, you made a very good point that it is, and I'm one of them, it's dominated. I'm not public school, but the press is dominated by white men. And like 80%, 60% of all journalists in Fleet Street went to private school, which is 6% of the population. And something like 80% of their editors. So no wonder if the diversity of this country is underrepresented, it's also misrepresented. And that's one of the missions of Byline Times. Half our journalists full-time are women, and we have lots of people with very interesting backgrounds being our lead writers. That in that diversity is also independence, I think, and this is the people have to accept about the independent media. It will be very different, all entities, and they should be different. Politically, we're not actually very aligned. One of my feelings about journalism, particularly having watched it over the years, that there isn't enough separation of fact, and we call it argument and comment. And we sort of really just felt we need to cover more news and investigations, like break stuff the papers didn't say. But I've always, these news sites like Canary have sprung up, Novara Media, they also give a new, they break stories, but they also share new different kinds of opinions. And that's great. But our focus is on really breaking news. And one of the things we've kind of discovered about this is I did geography for A-level, so I use the analogy of plate tectonics. How do you tell a story? Because as Jonathan says, extractive industry and everybody's covering it, really good, something happens. How do you cover a story which nobody else is covering? And one of the things is to look at the biggest structural issues, especially racism, misogyny, corruption, oligarchy. And then if you know where those fault plates are, there's always going to be a volcano or a earthquake somewhere on those subductions or induction zones. And that's what we did very early on a year ago with the issue of procurement and PPE, but also about the war and woke, the cultural wars, which our editor, Hardeep Matharo, whose parents are Punjabi from via Kenya, voted for Brexit. She's very aware of these sort of these issues. And on that independence, that's my key thing, is how to keep that, how to keep, we aligned, like I read this really, we have Peter Oborne writing for us, who is a One Nation Conservative, all the way, you know, quite hard left, middle left, Lib Dems, Green, you know, and centrist Labour. Because we're not really focusing on the knock-on effects of the politics, more getting the raw or the information out there, we prefer to leave the interpretation, at least of the political consequences, to others, because others are more equipped. One of the things which happens through this, you think we wouldn't get much loyalty, but I think we get a lot of loyalty mainly because of the subscription model. Because I think others have this too, the only thing that keeps us afloat is our readers, and their extra money sometimes they spend to have their name on the front of the paper or the back of the paper. Our engagement with them is our key kind of brand, and it is also they are our champions. So, you know, you have citizen journalists, full trained journalists working for Byline Times, and then you have citizen editors or citizen champions who create this sense of a movement. People leave our papers, the grandmother who reads the Daily Mail. And in a way, our editor sometimes describes this as it's like a local paper. It's like a local paper, but it's national, has foreign coverage. Crowdfunding didn't work because we couldn't guarantee the overheads to edit stuff. The legal side, I'm sure all of you are aware, is expensive, time consuming, any investigation. And we found a mixture of crowdfunding and revenue gets us going there. But in a way, we're partly led by our audience and partly by what is not being exposed. And I think that's, you know, there's a whole different bunch of stuff that needs to be done there. And I spent my life criticizing legacy mainstream media. In fact, I think it is a huge opportunity because people are so hungry. We're now completely broken even for the last 6 months, and the subscription's going all the time. People send us stories. The audience has been sort of cheated, if you like. But once they're given a sense of truth or a sense of somebody listening to their stories, you get so many stories from our audience. I think it just grow and grow.
Amazing. Thank you, Peter, and well done again for all of your work at Byline Times. It is an essential part of the independent media landscape. Okay, we have got a whole ton of questions, so I'm going to go straight to them now. If you guys want to just all unmute yourselves, and you stick up your hand if you want to tackle one of these questions, and I'll come to you. So first of all, we have a question from Cal Alexander Rossetti, who says, competition for live space happens a lot in indie media. Are the indies going to start cooperating in broadcast shows so viewers can engage with all outlets?
I'll answer that since nobody else did, because I'm always talk a lot. We always enjoy collaborating with Open Democracy, as I said, New Internationalist. We're doing a joint promotion. I do a lot of interviews for Double Down News. I think you know, we can. The problem is, I think you can't just create one platform for us because we all rely on those revenue streams. And there is inevitably part of that diversity is going to be a bit of competition. You know, we collaborate when we can. There's differences. And the idea that we could become, you know, uniform or aligned on everything would ruin the independence of it all. So you know, it's a great sector. Alliances are formed. We're all here today. So, but I just don't think you can create one channel for it, because then the ability to raise money and pay our journalists might be diminished.
Vanessa, did you want to come in on that one?
No, I kind of agree to some extent, but I think that the scope for collaboration, I think it is great, really, and I think, we have often shared with others in the past when we had an incredibly successful marketing model. We used to share it with others very freely on the left because we wanted everybody to succeed. And we now go to others, and for example, Byline Times, and we talk to them, and they've been very helpful with us talking about what's working for their marketing. Now, that's all fairly hard-nosed, businessy type stuff, and yet we're kind of happy to do it. So, I think that's quite special.
Yeah, I would concur. Okay. So we have, should or could we replace BBC license fee with a fee for journalism?
I mean, I'm interested in this question. It's been going around for a while. There was a proposal almost 10 or 15 years ago to change the license fee into something called a public service publishing fee, which could then potentially be, rather than just being dumped on the BBC, different news producers, whether they're broadcast, print, digital, could compete for that fee and sort of tender for it in various ways. I think the crux of the debate, where it gets very difficult, and I'm sure people sort of watching this event will have very different views about the BBC, but there's quite a hardcore of people who think the BBC, warts and all, is a pretty good thing, and they're very scared. Even sort of progressive people very scared about letting go of the BBC and opening up some sort of competitive market. I take a slightly different view. I mean, I think the BBC is a potentially very good thing, could be a better thing, but doesn't need to take all of the potential public subsidy. We know that there's a profound market failure in all sorts of areas of news, whether it's local or investigative or alternative. If you could get some money, and I don't care particularly where it comes from, whether it comes from big tech or general taxation or a license fee type model, but if you can get some of that money and channel it into a diversity of media sources, that to me is something that I would really like to explore. But the way you do that is quite a challenge, because obviously what you don't want to do is create a pot that politicians then sit on top of and pick favourites and pick winners. So you've got to do that in a really independent kind of way. But there are models out there. There are countries like Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, New Zealand is about to launch a new fund for public interest journalism. There are countries that are trying to do this. And I think the UK, whether it's top slicing or destroying the BBC license fee, as I say, I'm neutral about that. But the basic idea that there has got to be some public money available for genuinely independent journalism, I think, yes, it's just how.
Peter, did you want to come in?
Yeah, the problem is the track record isn't brilliant. I don't know if you remember the local reporter scheme. Lots of independent journalists rate it, but that was top slicing BBC money. A lot of it went to fund, quite large media corporations, and it was a sort of deal sorted out by John Whittingdale to please his friends in the press. Always, as we see, and this is the problem with public money, like in procurement, as Jonathan says, who gets the grants, and then you have that whole problem of picking winners, gatekeepers. I'm sure, Jonathan, there's better ways of doing it that doesn't lead to those problems. But at the moment, every time we know, 50-60 million now has been spent on government advertising and sponsored adverts. Some of them saying how great Brexit is during the pandemic, to all the big publishers like News UK and Associated and Reach. I'm always worried about public money with powerful press barons, them getting their hands on it.
Vanessa, did you want to come in on that one?
I agree with the last point about the powerful press barons. I mean, I'm also worried about governments and changing governments that then completely reverse things. You would have to be very protected from government interference and sit quite definitely apart from that. I wonder whether it's something which is more successful in countries where they have proportional representation, perhaps more coalition governments, that kind of thing. in our very polarized system, I could see it all, going bad.
Yeah, carnage. Corruption and carnage awaits. Okay. This is an interesting question, and I suspect that the answers will be quite nuanced, but you feel free to surprise me. Do you think COVID has helped or hindered the rise of independent media?
I'm really tempted to try to give like a really ridiculously sort of brazen answer, Carrie-Anne, now that you said you don't really want a nuanced answer. It's like, yes, it's absolutely transformed it for the better. Everyone's doing really well. But that's not the case, but nor is it the case that it's devastated the sector. I'm afraid the reality is that it's a bit nuanced. One of the things that we saw early on in the pandemic, we surveyed as many independent publishers as could be bothered to complete the survey, and the vast majority were obviously really, really alarmed at what was going on, and were also really concerned that they didn't seem to be eligible for any kind of government support. So, Peter's mentioned the way that the government did channel quite a reasonable chunk of money, £35 million, into the newspaper industry, most of which went to the legacy publishers, the big legacy publishers. In fact, I'm only aware of one independent local newspaper which got even a few pounds of those 35 million. So the sector was really worried. It wasn't getting government support, but we have seen, and Vanessa and Peter can say whether this has been their experience or not, but we have seen a lot of examples where independent publications went to their readers and audiences and said, look, actually times are hard now, but we're desperate to keep serving you. Can you lean in? And in general, they were really amazed and touched by the positive response that they got. So some people have actually come through it stronger, but I'm afraid others have disappeared. We have lost, Impress has lost some members, and ICNN, the Independent Community News Network, has lost some members, and others have had to sort of really scale back their operation or focus on other sources of income, and essentially hibernate their publications whilst they get through.
Yeah, I mean, without being brazen, we were looking originally at Byline Times. We thought there might be a digital advertising model. It never manifested itself for us. So subscriptions happened, became our mainstay. And so I know advertising, for obvious reasons of lockdown and closed shops, has declined. So we weren't hit by that. The opposite happened. Actually, at both times when there was a big lockdown, there was a kind of stunned silence and low traffic. And then, I was suffering this time last year from weird COVID dreams of Barbara Windsor and Dominic Cummings, most bizarre. We actually had a huge uptick in traffic, mainly because we've got in early on the herd immunity issue. We did a very good timeline of the government's sort of failures. And we found, so that was a big rise in subscriptions and traffic for us. I mean, I hate to say this because I know other people have suffered. It has been good. It's been terrible because we can't work in an office, occasionally get to meet. But in terms of the audience's desire for news and information, or we did a lot of countering disinformation, like on the scamdemic movement or the branch Covidians, lockdown skeptics and their weird stats that they sort of pull out from some dark and humid place. And so with this April marks the first year of that. And yeah, I mean, maybe people stuck at home, they do want more information because they can't go out, but it's been good for us. But I feel very sorry for people who it hasn't been good for.
I think am I not muted or muted?
No, you're coming through loud and clear, Vanessa.
Okay, that's fine. I think on balance for us, it's been bad because most of our marketing is face-to-face marketing, and most of our recruitment of subscribers is at events, big events, either festivals or universities, so Freshers' Days, that kind of thing. So we've been hit quite hard, and it'll carry on through to next year as well. But I think we had a similar kind of response from our readers, who really appreciated the fact that we weren't taking up offers of furlough or anything like that. Not the editorial staff anyway, because we knew that we needed. This was a time when journalism was absolutely needed, and so it was all all hands to the pump and keep going. So it's been a kind of it's a mixed thing. I mean, emotionally, it's been quite kind of. We've been encouraged by the continuing support of our readers and subscribers. But if we look ahead into the future, it's not good.
Thank you, Vanessa. So everyone who's listening, get and support New Internationalist. Make sure they keep going. They're very, very important, and we cannot lose them from our landscape. Okay. Where did that question from Jason Goodland go? This is a Trixie Hobbit question. Jason Crisden says, are we at the point now where the independent left-wing media should suggest not voting for any establishment parties?
Can I just say, I'm not sure it is. I'm certainly not bothered Byline Times to tell people how to vote. It's kind of, we're quite clear cut that because we believe in transparency, probity, not lying, not twisting the electorate, but various things during the last election, 2019, that we were recommending people not to vote for Boris Johnson quite strongly. But anyway, it's just a different attitude. In our space, we don't tell people to vote. We encourage activism, especially on individual issues. We do a little bit of political analysis, but quite scattered. And it's, there seems to be a lot of, I'm not saying activist journalism, that's great. There seems to be a lot of political debate journalism. We see ourselves slightly down the food chain as what facts are you going to debate? So we try to, not always, we get things wrong, we try to really concentrate issues like Islamophobia, digging out Nafiz Ahmed, all the dark money coming in from America, and Trumpocracy, as we call it. I mean, we wouldn't want people to vote for Trump, obviously. So that's the limit. I know people find it very odd we don't do that. They think we're being scared or something, but it's just the kind of space we want to be in, is provide the information to make the democratic choice rather than urge any particular democratic choice.
Thank you, Peter. Does anyone else like to come in on that one? Go, Vanessa.
I mean, similarly, we're not party political, and not in this country, and not in any other country either. But we are on the left, and we do occasionally, before elections, give an opinion piece about how we think people should vote, if they're depending on where they are and what their situation is. So we have done that. But generally speaking, we're not allied to any one political party.
And Jonathan, did you want to come in?
Well, I have to be sort of quite careful here, because PINT is a charity. We're the first charity in the UK, as I think you said at the start, to have this remit of promoting public interest news. So, I may have my personal views on that question, but in terms of PINT, our job is a bit like how Peter was sort of outlining how he sees Byline's role. We want to support a really healthy ecosystem of a lot of independent public interest news. That may include political sites with a strong political perspective, but I think it will also include a lot of publications which see their role as being to host the debate, not to intervene in the debate. So personally, I think I need to sort of step back from that question.
Yes, sensible. And I'm chairing, so I can't answer. So I'm just going to leave it there. I think we've burned through the questions. So I think what I'd like to do is give each of you just 2 minutes to kind of round up your thoughts and maybe give us a flavour of what you see as being, the next few years of independent media. What are the big challenges? What are the opportunities? What are you excited about? That's kind of not just on behalf of your own organisation, but the wider independent news media landscape. And who's going to be brave and go first? That is the question.
Okay, I'll go first, just because you challenged me with the brave thing, and obviously appealed to some in a macho inside me. Yeah, what Jonathan was saying about public interest, and that it's great that if, because we haven't, as far as I understand it, the charity sector is being sort of cut off from the journalist end, and even there are some exceptions like Unearth, and some great journalism done there by people working under the aegis of charities. That's what I think we need more of, is that deep research work. And more localism. So the two things I'm really proud about. Well, one thing hasn't happened yet. But one thing I'm so proud is our Bylines network. We have 9 now regional bylines, which are loosely affiliated. We provide the kind of values we've imbibed from Impress and the software hosting it. And they are kind of training up. I mean, they're just getting hundreds of people writing for them. I mean, they don't have to go the same editorial process. There is some oversight. And there just seems to be a groundswell of these people wanting to come out and write for their local communities, because we're not very London centric, because we don't cover Westminster, but we are in London, but South London, and that's different. Remember that. But we feel that the regional aspect and local politics and local council, that those voices, they need to come up, and we hope to feed up from those local to the national and the international. And that's, if we can do that, that's brilliant.
That's amazing. Thank you, Peter. And next, can we go to Vanessa?
Yeah, I'm just impressed by how many, independent media there are. Jonathan was saying 300, and you sort of think this is the worst time to be trying to do this, and yet it's also the best time. And some of the best work journalism is coming out, and I think that's going to carry on. And I see young journalists coming through who are working in conditions which are much, much harder than the ones when I joined and went into journalism, and with a kind of commitment and a commitment to accuracy, to searching for truth, to investigative journalism, that is, truly inspiring. So I feel, on the one hand, it's kind of, things are sort of precarious and more precarious for some of us than others, but at the same time, it's extraordinarily dynamic and exciting. And I think that the legacy media is probably looking at what's going on in the independent sector and thinking, blimey, we better sharpen up our act a bit, because these guys are pretty good.
Snapping at your heels. Brilliant. Thank you, Vanessa. And Jonathan?
I think that's right, actually, Vanessa. I think one of the things that I found really interesting in the last couple of years is that the legacy media are now trying to adopt the language of independence. You keep hearing them talking about their journalism as independent, which wasn't, apart from the independent, that wasn't something you often heard. It wasn't a word that they saw as valuable, something to prize. So they're trying to adopt that language. They're talking a lot more about the fact that their journalism serves the public interest, which again wasn't always something you heard them saying. So they're definitely struggling to reassert their public value in a way that they didn't need to do when they had this sort of hegemonic control of both the industry and public discourse. They are on the back foot in that way, but they are still very large, very powerful companies, and they still employ a lot of journalists. And thinking from this sort of NUJ perspective, I think we should all be concerned for all the journalists who are employed by legacy media, whether it's private press or public broadcasters. I don't want the future to be one where those organizations simply collapse and there are no journalistic jobs. I would like there to be, 1,000 really great news organizations across the UK, some of them perhaps big old private, big old public, but many of them well-resourced, sustainable, smaller, independent organizations. I think I'm really confident that whatever happens, unless the bomb drops, there will continue to be a lot of independent media. But I think it would be a shame if in 5 or 10 years' time, it was still a lot of very small, very fragile organizations that are having to run really hard to do little more than stand still. I think the problem there is you get burnout, people are going to be exhausted, there are going to be mental health problems, and it's just a waste of energy. And it seems to me with a tiny bit of investment, whether it's subsidy or philanthropy, some of those organizations will actually find sustainable business models. Others might continue to need a sort of helping hand for the foreseeable future. But I don't want them all to be worrying about fundraising and revenue. I want them just to be able to focus on journalism. And then you've got 1,000, whether they're big, small, right wing, left wing, centrist, impartial, political, private, non-profit, whatever. You've got 1,000 different good sources that people can turn to for news that actually speaks to them. So that's my happy vision, but it's going to take some intervention to get there.
It certainly is. Okay, I think, do you know what? I'm going to sneak in one last question, and then we can go. We've got a great question that's just come in, and it is tied to actually what Jonathan was saying. And I think probably you guys are going to have some quite strong opinions on this. So do you think charity should focus on the independent media more and trade unions?
I'll just very quickly answer that one. Yes, and to some extent charities are. There's a shift going on. If we're talking about like charitable foundations, the charities that have actually got money to give, they are starting to shift. There's a really good foundation called Lankelly Chase that funds a lot of good social justice work and work on the criminal justice system, which has started to acknowledge that unless you actually tackle some of the drivers of the narrative about those issues in the media, you're going to be running constantly, running up a steep uphill slope. So some of those charities are now really starting to recognise we need to sort of put money into reforming the media in order to address our core concerns. So yeah, there's a shift happening, but we need a hell of a lot more.
Just like to reiterate that the First Amendment provides for the right of free speech and assembly. So these are profound ways of organizing ourselves. And free speech isn't, by the way, just be able to shout offensive things at people as Toby Young might think. This also was designed, in the 19th century, J.S. Mill, for finding truth, for having the dissenting opinion, not just because it's dissenting, might actually have the answer to something, just very much like we find on so many issues Jonathan alerted to, like the justice system, climate change. We're just not hearing any expertise in that area and hearing a lot of propaganda. So yes.
Thank you, Peter. Vanessa.
Yes, I mean, I think just yes, they should, and I think it would be great if we got more. We do actually deal with charities quite a lot, particularly some of them sort of more radical NGOs, not the big ones. But I think a stronger relationship with the trade unions, I think, would be between Indomedia and the trade unions. I think would be a good thing too.
I wholeheartedly concur. And on that note, I would like to thank you, Peter, Vanessa, and Jonathan, for being just the most wonderful panelists this evening. Thank you for giving us your time and your expertise. I'm sure it's been very enlightening for the people out there watching. And I'd also like to thank the Media Reform Coalition for putting this incredible event together, everyone behind the scenes who is having this be such an extraordinary event. It's been wonderful to be a part of it, and I'm really looking forward to the final events coming up over the next couple of days. Obviously, we want to thank the partners who've joined with the Media Reform Coalition to bring you this event, and they are the Canary, Byline Times, Manchester Meteor, the Independent Media Association, Squawkbox, and Bywire News. Thank you for tuning in. We hope you've left you with lots of information and lots of avenues to help change the world a little bit, make it a little bit better. Until the next time, bye-bye.